Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the slight delay. You may notice there's an empty chair over on the far right there. That's because we were going to have a speaker from the company ERG, but unfortunately he's not going to make it. So you will instead be treated to some observations to kick us off from the three panelists that we do have with us, and let me introduce them to you. Starting from over on the right, we have Geir Kristoffersen, who was formerly at Johns Hopkins University, and now she has just told me devotes herself to writing books, so she'll kick things off. And then immediately to Geir's left, we have Nick Popovich from Glencore, and after that we have Nicholas Mas, the CEO of Orano Mining. And the topic, as I'm sure you're aware, is the geopolitics of critical raw materials, and to my mind at least, there is it's difficult to think of any other subject that has risen so fast to the top or near the top of the agendas of policymakers, both in government and in business around the world in recent times, for reasons that our panelists will explain to you all. So let's get started, and I'm going to hand the floor now to Geir Kristoffersen.
There we go. Oh, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. So the title I was given was The Geopolitics of Rare Earth, and I changed that into Can a Middle Power Practice Rare Earth Multivectorism in a World of Geopolitical Rivalry? So at the recent China Central Asia Investment Summit in Xi'an, President Tokayev noted that he did not want Central Asia to become an arena for geopolitical confrontation. So this raises a lot of questions for me. Can President Tokayev prevent geopolitical competition in Central Asia? Is multivectorism possible under conditions of geopolitical rivalry? Does Kazakhstan participation in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, undermine its multivectorism? The U.S. is reducing its dependence on China for rare earths and turning to alternative sources such as Kazakhstan. Can a middle power maintain working relations with both China, Russia, and the U.S. as geopolitics of major powers intensifies? So to anticipate what my answer will be, it is that there are different kinds of geopolitical rivalries. If the geopolitical rivalry is a bipolar world order created by US-China confrontation, then multivectorism becomes less possible. If the geopolitical rivalry is a loose US-China-Russia strategic triangle with many other power centers, for example, Europe or the Middle East, then multivectorism has some space to operate. So I don't think I need to explain multivectorism to a Kazakh audience. And I think that Kazakhstan right now is practicing multivectorism in rare earths development. What I'd like to look at is US-China relations and ask whether or not it's heading towards a bipolar order. So I should mention that US-China relations in mining go back to the 19th century, and many, many Chinese were trained in the United States in the early 20th century at places like the Colorado School of Mines, and also at MIT. So when relations were renewed under the economic reforms, for many, it was just picking up where they left off before 1949. The The key thing about U.S.-China relations is the architects in 1979 wanted to build a relationship that depended on 1,000 silk threads. So each silk thread is very fragile, but if you put 1,000 threads together, it's very strong. And that was the intent of the original architects of U.S.-China relations, that it would be a multifaceted relationship with many linkages, people to people, university to university, business to business, and Washington would not control all of it, because Washington goes up and down. I remember in the early 80s, there was a project at the East-West Center where some minerals economists developed a relationship with their Chinese counterparts. So up until then, I think Chinese were minerals mining engineers or geologists, but they weren't minerals economists. They didn't have a good sense of the economic analysis of rare earths or minerals of any kind. And so this East-West Center project started, and I think it was very beneficial to the Chinese. At a certain point, securitization began. It was actually 3 decades ago that securitization began. And so the first question you might ask is, why did it take so long? Why did it take 3 decades? And that's because there were so many silk threads holding the relationship together. And it began probably about 1995. There was an American firm that had 2 Chinese corporations, and they acquired a company called Magnet Quench, and this was magnet production, whereas the U.S. controlled 90% of the magnet production. The U.S. government approved the acquisition in the United States with the understanding that you stay 5 years in the United States. And so the company stayed exactly 5 years in the United States, and then they moved back to China, and they took all the technology with them. Ultimately, then, China became dominant in the magnet industry. As Beijing began building the strategic reserves of the critical rare earth elements, I'll just call it REE, the ministry began building up strategic reserves of minerals. And at some point, the United States and Japan began to notice this. But a key point in securitization was 2010, when Beijing blocked rare earth supply to Japan. And this was related to the Senkaku-Diaoyu Island dispute. So this blockage then created a global rare earth supply crisis, and it drove up the price of rare earths. Tokyo responded by finding alternative sources, and eventually the Chinese government reduced the price, and it was more or less went back to normal, but the United States and Europe and Japan filed a complaint with the WTO. In 2012, in Beijing lost the WTO case. So that was one critical point in securitization. Then many non-Chinese companies, American companies, hoped to build up the REE business, but Beijing realized it would lose its monopoly, and so it dropped its prices further and undermined any efforts for American companies to develop rare earths. So a turning point of securitization was in 2017 when President Trump signed an executive order that would support American rare earth domestic industry. And the Pentagon also was involved in this, and they provided $125 million to develop rare earths in the United States. And a key place is in California, where I'm from. It's called Mountain Pass. It's a rare earth open pit mine. China tried to acquire Mountain Pass mine back in 2005 when it was owned by Unocal, when China tried to buy Unocal. but it was blocked by the US government. Then in 2020, the Pentagon awarded MP Materials, which controls Mountain Pass, $10 million to create a refining facility. And then last year awarded $35 million to design and build a processing facility. And they awarded money to other companies as well. So the concern then, in terms of the US securitizing its dependence on supply from China, was that China controlled maybe 80% of the global supply and 91% of refining activity. It definitely had a monopoly. And at this point, the US linked microchips with rare earth elements. They were both supply chains that the US felt threatened US national security. So the peak of securitization happened in February 2021 when President Biden, he was only 1 month as president, he signed an executive order to rebuild the domestic supply chain for rare earths. And they also decided to withhold microchips to China, which were dual use. In other words, microchips that could be used in military equipment. This was reflected in what was called the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 to produce American domestic semiconductor manufacturing. So the securitization was not only on the American side, it was also on the Chinese side. The Chinese government then, by that time, was worried that if it exported rare earths to the United States, it might be used in the production of F-35s, planes. So they started to think about prohibiting the export of technologies used for refining rare earth materials. So securitization was going on both sides. In 2022 then, the US also promoted something called the Minerals Security Partnership between the United States and several key partner countries in Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and the European Commission. And the point was to bring the MSP countries together with mineral-rich countries and create new supply lines, new supply chains that might not have existed before. And of course, that was to be less dependent on China. In April of this year, the G7 agreed to expand cooperation on critical minerals security and supply chains. In their communique, they committed to supporting open, transparent rules and market-based trade in critical minerals. So it definitely seemed that it was moving towards serious securitization. But in April 2023, the American National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said the US is de-risking relations with China on a very narrow slice of technologies, but we're not interested in decoupling. So how to explain the switch? Well, on the one hand, you can talk about external factors. I think maybe European countries encourage the US to shift towards de-risking rather than decoupling. But I would also explain it in terms of the 1,000 silken threads that over the years with securitization, a lot of silk threads had been broken, especially military to military relations. But there were still 900 silk threads. So there were a lot of domestic factors that would keep the relationship from completely decoupling or being totally securitized into a bipolar order. So the MSP is not really a bloc. It's market-based relations, and therefore it would not contribute to a bipolar world order. It just means diversifying the U.S. rare earths supply chain, and that would include alternative exporters such as Kazakhstan. The United States is one of the biggest investors in the Kazakhstan economy, especially in mining. There's actually, if we were to look at the US, China, Russia relationship to Kazakhstan, I think you can see it better in uranium. There's been a couple of uranium deals lately in terms of Russian investment in a Kazakh mine. And then there's been a contract also with China, with CNNC. So Kazakhstan is definitely developing relations with many different countries in uranium. So it's a good case study of how Kazakhstan's middle power strategies would work. The question is, on this deal relating to Moscow in particular, was Kazakhstan just the arena for great power rivalry in terms of Russia developing so much control over a Kazakh mine, or was it a choice on the part of the government to sort of balance China, Russia, the United States, Europe, and other countries? So this US shifting to de-risking, I read about it in the newspaper, but it tends to be very shallow. They don't get into details about what they mean about de-risking. But I think if you look at rare earths, you can get into it a little bit deeper. I believe that there are domestic reasons, domestic factors, and there are external factors that would push the United States towards de-risking rather than decoupling, and that means we're not shifting towards a bipolar world. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for Kazakhstan's multi-vector relationships because it can maintain relations then with Russia, China, and the US. And it could join the supply chains of the MSP and the G7. And so anyway, so the conclusion of what I'm saying is I don't think we're shifting towards a bipolar order.
Thank you very much, Gaia. Well, it's, I suppose, encouraging to hear that 900 out of 1,000 silk threads are still intact in the US-Chinese relationship. Let's turn to Nick Popovich of Glencore. Over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you, Tony. When we talk about the geopolitics of critical raw materials, I'd like to first of all focus on what is it we understand by which minerals are we speaking of and why they're so critical, why the geopolitics. So the drive towards electrification on ESG grounds is something which is transformational because it is what determines not the demand but the speed at which demand will grow. So usually when we talk about the metals which go into the battery of an electric vehicle, we usually tend to think of lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, other elements like graphite, fluorine. So what makes these metals and elements different from the other ones? Are they more scarce? Is it a question that you cannot mine them and that they're all located in difficult jurisdictions, which creates a bottleneck in the industry? I would argue that that's not the critical issue. What's happened is that the drive towards switching from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles is driven by society's preferences, because as the ESG movement put pressure on society to decarbonize, the first hit came to the car manufacturers who had to declare that they will make a transformation from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles at a pace which is simply not possible in terms of the time it takes to develop the supply chain. So that is a very ambitious task. Over the past 2 years, we've seen very ambitious announcements by various car manufacturers who are taking it upon themselves to change the type of vehicles they're making, what has taken decades to build in a space of a couple of years. That is a hugely ambitious task, both from the point of view of funding and the expertise it takes to do that. It then brings the question of the supply chain. How will that develop? So that gets us to, that's why they're critical. It's critical because the speed at which they have to develop is not linked to the realities on the ground of how do you mine and refine those metals. So where does the geopolitics come into the equation? The question is, how does each country respond to the challenge that comes in place? And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that China's response to the challenge of electrification has been much faster than the West. Now, the question I think is pertinent is, why is China quicker? And if you look at the organization of the economy, the skill that went into developing the response to the challenge is that you have large players who generally have a more secured market for their output, that the development of the electric vehicle industry has moved pretty much in unison across the board. Partially because a lot of the players are state-owned, so the coordination of efforts works at a faster pace. You get economies of scale because there are large research institutes, large manufacturers, which make it easier to go from the decision, from the concept to decision to feasibility study and construction. You can do a lot of copy-paste, where similar type plants will spring up quickly, mines will develop, and that covers the supply chain in a fairly short space of time. Now, for a Western company, the challenge is different. From concept to design to approval of something being built requires a lot more scrutiny. First of all, because we are dealing with a market economy where, in a transformational period, you're not sure whether your supply chain is there. You know, there's no closed loop on the Western side, which excludes China, broadly speaking. So it makes it difficult to make an investment decision if you don't know where your output will go, whether your input into a battery will be matched in time with the commissioning of a battery plant that will take your product. A lot of the inputs that go into production are custom made for specific plants. They're not freely tradable commodities like refined metals, where you can take a position and sell to the highest bidder. There's a lot more coordination required. This takes time. So I would say that with time, the response of Western companies to this will catch up with China. The question is that if you have a different pace of response to the challenge, you will create effectively an antitrust situation, because you will have a much larger concentration of economic power in the hands of one bloc, and that will create fear and uncertainty for the other, which is what, again, requires government intervention, as we're seeing both in the United States, in Canada, and in the European Union. How do you meet that challenge? Because simply waiting for individual companies to get in place may take much longer. The strain on the car manufacturers is huge because when you commit to many billions of dollars of investments, you don't want to be caught in a situation that you become collateral damage to a geopolitical situation where you're expected to have a non-Chinese supply chain, but it's not available. The strains become even bigger because with the economies of scale that are enjoyed by the Chinese manufacturers, it's difficult for individual European or American producers to have the same playing field to deliver the various component parts at the right price. Now, important to note, it's not just the individual metals that we're speaking of. We're talking about precursors, where first the metals have to be refined to battery-grade sulfates. They need to be combined in specific ratios that suit the cathode active material producers, who are in turn driven by the demands of the car manufacturers. And they're not always standardized, so that creates a gap in the system, which I would refer to as an antitrust challenge, which you now have across borders. So the geopolitics of it makes it more difficult because from an ESG perspective, we see a preference from the West not to engage with the supply of metals from certain jurisdictions, and which limits the source of supply. And that is a challenge because it's almost a situation like having your cake and eating it, because you want to have metals from the select countries, and at the same time, that limits you geologically to countries which may have smaller supplies, and which will take longer to explore, to develop, and bring to market. So this is the challenge that we're facing. Now, I believe that the free market principle will prevail in the end, that the gap will narrow over time. But it is something which will not happen overnight. So we have a unique situation where for generations we haven't had the amount of government involvement in an economic game which is supposed to determine the winners in this game. So it's something which in many ways is an unprecedented situation, that we've switched from, let's say, from the invisible hand approach that markets will prevail to one where the fact that the demand is driven by changes in tastes which are communicated in various ways through society, it changes the speed at which people need to work. That will create stresses. To complicate the situation, you also have a huge amount of technological progress which is going simultaneously. So when you have to make a large investment in to feed the supply chain, you also want to make sure that you're not caught on the wrong side of history, that you don't commit to a large investment in something which might be outdated by the time you're commissioning it. Because we're still in a very young industry. A lot of the products which are now becoming standard for the car manufacturing industry have not been around for more than a couple of years. So it would take a very brave person to say that what we are producing today for the batteries is the final game, that there won't be material change. It's something where the size of the prize is throwing very bright minds at the process. So it's something which for the West is making a shift that metallurgists who were previously working in other industries are now focusing their efforts on the battery industry and finding innovative solutions. So this is something which is a very exciting space to watch. I mean, we see more information than we're able to digest in terms of what is out there, what are people trying to create. So there will be many successes, there will be failures, there will be collateral damage in the process, but it's something which will define our generation in terms of that move towards cleaner vehicles on the street, and it will be an exciting thing to watch. The politics is going to be a fundamental part of that, and the confidence that governments need to inspire. Now, whether that's through credits, whether that's through subsidies, tax breaks, there are different components to the parts. It will take a lot of effort on the part of the governments to instill confidence in industry that the policy towards electric vehicles will not change with a change in administration. So the electoral process is something which also can change the dynamics of what we are seeing. So there will be challenges, and it is by nature, because of the speed at which the industry needs to transform, is something which will not be a usual game of demand and supply. So in conclusion, I would say it's not a situation that the commodity industry often likes to say that this time is different. It's a supply-constrained business, that there won't be enough of the metals. I don't believe that to be the case. It's just a question of that the market is moving at a much faster rate than the industry can supply. So we will see constraints, we will see bottlenecks, we'll see booms and busts in the process. That will take a couple of years to play out, and this is where every company really has to have their finger on the trigger to ensure that they act quickly, decisively, because it will be difficult to rely on historical precedent, because there is none for this business.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, that was certainly a trenchant view of the challenges that face the car manufacturing industry. I imagine similar challenges actually face other industries of the future, not just car manufacturing, but it sounds formidable enough for the automobile industry on its own. So, the third and final speaker, Nicholas Meis from Orano Institute.
Thanks, Tony. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Nicolas Meis, the CEO for Orano Mining. Orano Mining is a mining division of the Orano Group. Orano Group is involved in the whole nuclear fuel cycle. So what we do is mining, then conversion, enrichment of uranium, and then spent fuel reprocessing once it's been used in the nuclear power plants. About 10% of the French electricity today is produced with recycled or reprocessed nuclear fuel, for example. And based on those competencies, we're also expanding, and I will come back to that, on other minerals and aspects as part of the energy transition. We're a French company, so obviously European, and based on where we're based and what we do, I will share a view that is more a European view, and as well focus a bit more on the next step after mining, but processing part, which in our view is a key part of that critical raw material story. For the definition of critical raw materials, there are lots of debates, lots of lists. You've seen the US yesterday publish their revamped list of critical material and strategic material and nearly strategic materials, whatever you can name them. In our view, there are 3 dimensions to critical materials. One of them is the concentration of production in a limited number of countries. And when we say concentration of production, it's concentration of where they originate from, or concentration of where they are being processed, and where they are being processed in their next step of the value chain, or sometimes several steps down the value chain. Let's take a quick example. You take the rare earths value chain that Gaia described. Today you would get rare earths, you could extract them, separate them, but then to use them in magnets, you need to get the metallization step. And that metallization step today is 98% concentrated in China. So it's 2 steps down the value chain. And for the end users, it's 2 steps up the value chain. And if you don't look at the whole value chain and you secure your initial material, you could set up your industry and still be blocked exactly the same way. So first element, concentration of production in our view. The second thing is obviously scarcity of available resources, especially when faced with growing demand, as you described, Nick. The third point in our view for critical raw material is increasing concerns by government, citizens, populations, and companies about the environmental footprint and the ability to get a clear traceability of where those materials originate from and in which conditions they were produced and or processed. The stakes are huge for the EU. As you know, the EU has decided to switch completely to electrical vehicles, moving away from the traditional thermal vehicles, and as well is developing very fast in solar panels and windmills and everything like that. And all those transitions, they put a huge stress on the value chain. And the EU is today, has made that political decisions, but vastly, we've got none of those materials being produced in the EU. So we rely completely at the moment on value chains that are external to the EU, and this is true for extraction as well as processing. Faced with that challenge, the EU understanding is that the EU approach is that strategic autonomy does not mean complete self-sufficiency, which anyway wouldn't be realistic in our approach. It doesn't mean either economic and political protectionism by isolating ourselves from the world. The EU approach is rather an approach where we want to develop alternatives, options, competition, and avoiding, obviously, unwanted dependencies, both economically and geopolitically. And the example I took on rare earths and that metallization step today is an unwanted dependency for the whole world on one key processing step that is today captured by China. And that dependency and that very high concentration at the end is what triggers tensions. So in the EU approach, the levers are identified and they complement each other. One of the levers is, of course, to restart or encourage domestic mining of raw materials. And we see a number of European countries trying to update their mining codes. That was the case in France 2 years ago. Update the mining code and understand and communicate on sustainable mining and sustainable mining initiatives and trying to reinitiate mining for some of the materials in Europe. The successes are uneven. Today, I would say that Scandinavia is progressing well and is having good luck at it. France is still stuck, but domestic mining is one part. The second part is diversifying the union's imports of raw material with key partners countries. In a way, that's what is done today for uranium mining. Uranium is not classified as critical raw material because it is available vastly around the world, but still uranium mining is seen as a way to bridge, not to bridge, but to develop partnership with a number of key countries. And certainly, speaking from our experience, our uranium projects in Niger, in Canada, here in Kazakhstan, the one we're developing in Uzbekistan and Mongolia, they are always a key part in the strategic relationship between our country, say France, and the country where we operate our projects. So domestic mining, diversifying unions, recycling, and in the EU approach, recycling is seen as a key step to manage autonomy or to manage the supply of those raw materials. And next to recycling, then it's a policy. You referred to what governments have to do in terms of confidence. What the EU is doing as well on the policy part is to foster the recycling approach. To take the example of the car batteries manufacturing, there was an act voted by the EU 2 years ago, I think, which mandates that electrical vehicles batteries are recycled. When you recycle them, they mandate a performance level for recycling. So say, when you recycle your batteries, you need to extract more than 95% of the minerals of interest, say cobalt, nickel, manganese, lithium. And if you don't achieve those rates, it doesn't qualify as recycling. And it mandates as well that new batteries incorporate a given percentage of recycled material. And that way, it's a way to close the loop to make sure that recycling is properly done, but to make sure as well that you create a market for recycling. Because at the moment, if you don't do that, fresh material will always be more competitive than recycled material. And so recycled material would remain a wishful thinking approach, but not one that will really trigger autonomy. By mandating that a percentage of recycled material is incorporated in new batteries, that would drive that. Now, of course, there is not enough end-of-life batteries at the moment. So the policy approach is to set an increasing rate of recycled materials in the batteries so that over time, as recycled materials or end-of-life batteries become available, you can incorporate that in the EU. And there is a fifth element, so domestic mining, diversifying, recycling policy. The final part is financing, obviously, because at the end, even though the car manufacturers are putting a high focus on ESG goals and recycling, at the end of the conversation with them, you always get, and it needs to be competitive, because the EU approach is one of a free market and a competitive market. And their governments and the EU can play a key role in helping those industries being competitive. Because of our political framework and economical framework, it's sometimes more difficult than in other jurisdictions. You've seen what the US did with IRA, where they're putting a lot of money to develop their supply chain. Such approach wouldn't be completely possible in the EU. Now, governments have realized that, and now they've developed some initiatives to support projects of common interest, common economical interest. And that's the way the first gigafactory for batteries have been subsidized or authorized to be subsidized. And at the moment, some projects related to pre-CAM and CAM are also being funded by governments. And it's not only financing, getting interest-free loan, but it's as well supporting the development of those factories that will then compete on an open market. Now, what can a company like Orano do in that landscape, and why, as being in uranium, which is not a critical raw material, we're involved in that story? In fact, there are a lot of similarities with the uranium value chain, say mining and then processing and then recycling. A lot of similarities with a number of the critical raw material supply chain. To start with, a number of the key competencies that are required are the same. metallurgy, hydrometallurgy, powders metallurgy, heavy industrial sites, heavily regulated, and those aspects are aspects that we have. Then there are similarities in the business model. Uranium is sold to electricians, and then they get it processed to converters plant and to enrichment plants, and then they get it reprocessed when they want. That's the case for France. And so we have in that supply chain the coexistence of several business models. Some of them were, part of it is directly operated by the industrial company, like us, and part of it is operated by us as well, but what we provide is a service to the end user. And so we have toll milling business model, as well as buy and sell business model for those materials. And what we're seeing happening in the critical raw materials is that those various business models will coexist. We see, which is not very usual, the car industry, for example, trying to secure minerals at the front end and trying to secure offtake in the mines. But then once they've got that offtake, they need to do something with it. And so either they will support it and then go buy and sell, or they will get it toll milled. And all of that is things that we're doing in the uranium mining industry. So we've decided to go, a company like us, we've decided to step in a number of steps of the value chain based on our know-how, competencies, and industrial aspect. So one of them is electrical vehicle batteries. We've just announced 2 weeks ago very significant investment for a pre-CAM and CAM manufacturing plant in the north of France. And we're doing it in joint venture with a Chinese company. As I said, in the EU approach, we are not in an approach to close the doors and isolate ourselves. We're more in an approach to use those industries to bridge gap and to develop strategic partnership. So we expect to commission our CAM factory at the end of 2026, so it's pretty soon, to feed some of the European gigafactory. Pre-CAM CAM is one of them, and electrical vehicles battery recycling as well is one of the steps that we're investigating, again based on our know-how. The second part is rare earth element and permanent magnets. Today, most of the, especially heavy rare earth elements, are being separated in China. But they are being separated in China with some of the process know-how that was initially developed in France by what is today Solvay. It was in La Rochelle plant. It was known differently in the past as a name. But part of the process know-how is there. What we believe is that the world doesn't need 20 rare earth processing plants. It doesn't need. But having only one plant today, or say one country today mastering and operating that part, is going to generate tensions. By definition, it will generate tension. You referred to it, Gaia, already. So we are actively working in France on developing processing steps there to offer alternatives to countries that would like to get their rare earths processed, and as well recycle permanent magnet and extract from them rare earths. And the third example of what we're doing is, you've got the materials, and some of them, what matters is some isotopes of those materials. And those separating isotopes is basically what you do when you do uranium enrichment. So we're building, as we speak, a stable isotopes separation plant using the centrifugation units technology that we've got for uranium enrichment. And that will offer alternative for a number of stable isotopes to what exists today, which is a very heavy concentration in Russia in particular for some of those isotopes. So using existing technology and developing them to offer alternative every time there is a situation where there is only one block, say, we call them one block, mastering a part of the element.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Well, we have just about half an hour before the session concludes, and I'm anxious to involve you and the audience with your questions to the panel. Before we do that, though, I might just throw a question of my own to the panelists. And what we've heard from each of you is, first of all, a sketching out of the intensifying, as Gaia put it, the securitization of the issue of access to critical raw materials, between the US and China. And then we heard Nick talking about the specific case of the car manufacturing industry and how that's affecting Chinese makers and US and European makers of cars. And then finally, the perspective from Europe, from Nicholas. I'd like to, bearing in mind that here we are in Astana, capital of Kazakhstan, which likes to think of itself as a middle power, and one that's not aligned with the US or the G7 and not aligned with China. But there are many other countries in the world with a similar outlook to Kazakhstan. How are they going to be affected by this question of intensifying competition for access to critical raw materials? Is there a risk some will lose out? Look at all the countries of Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, Africa, South America. How do you see the challenges for those countries that are outside the Western Chinese competition go? Let's start. Okay, Nick, you start.
Sorry. We operate in many countries where we see exactly that dilemma that you say, because countries that are rich in the resources that are required for this transformational drive are caught between two poles. So you have China, who has worked faster in developing their EV industry. So if you take the cases of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Indonesia as two of the, I would say, larger ones, and to an extent Argentina, in each in their separate commodities. So Congo, where we are the largest cobalt producer, you have the only non-Chinese large cobalt producers are ourselves and ERG as a Kazakh company, who are both in this business. The rest of the industry is driven by Chinese companies. So you have, at the same time, what we are facing as being the large cobalt suppliers. First of all, the cobalt that we deliver is mostly delivered to Chinese processing plants, because you still don't have Western processing plants that will refine the cobalt to go into the battery components. So you have growing scrutiny. The ESG perspective has spoken about child labor, artisanal mining in the Congo, which has even gotten to the point where a year ago, when cobalt was tight in supply, a lot of car manufacturers seemed to be succumbing to the pressure and talking about lithium iron phosphate batteries as opposed to nickel, cobalt, manganese. In response, because it was seen to be the easier way out. Now, the drive in the lithium price has changed that, and we see that today the decisions are taking more on cost and scope basis, not so much on the source of origin. But what we have seen is that it changes the level field, because if as Western companies you're facing these challenges, that you're constantly perceived and portrayed in the press as the bad guys who are not supporting human rights, which is not based on fact. You know, we have been portrayed as a company that works in breach of ethical standards, which has nothing to do with our operations over there, but that is the perception. That is what gets thrown out in the media. If you switch to Indonesia on the nickel side, a lot of talk has been going around environmental standards and whether the tailings dams that are built for the nickel processing plants, the deforestation, whether that's something that Western car manufacturers should be involved in. But if you don't do that, you'll be in a position that you simply won't have sufficient quantities of nickel and cobalt for those batteries. So the social pressures are creating headwinds which complicate the position even more. Now, for the countries themselves, they face a situation where the fastest investment comes from Chinese companies. Now, looking at what we've seen in both Indonesia and the Congo, is that the companies who come in rely on what I referred to earlier as a copy-paste model. That if they see that the ore is similar to what their peers are doing from China, they will be fairly quick in investing. So the turnaround time from a Chinese company getting the license and being in production is 2-3 years. A Western company will complete its pre-feasibility study in 2 years, if lucky. So there's a huge difference in scope. Now, the pressure that creates for the host countries is that from one side you want to be geopolitically balanced and not pick winners, to be involved in both sides. But the lure is, if the cash comes quicker from one side, you will prioritize one country. It's not an easy dilemma. It has political connotations. If you pick one side, you are almost making a choice to be in one camp. There are many countries who face the same dilemma, that they are captive to a fight which they did not create. They just happen to have the minerals and want to develop them fast. There's no easy solution to it. What will happen, I believe, in the end is that the West will simply have to be a lot quicker in its decision-making process, because you can't, from one side, take too much time and at the other time complain that you didn't win the race on speed.
Yes, good point. So do you want to add something to that, Nicholas?
Since we are in Kazakhstan, I would like to take the example of the uranium industry and what the Kazakh uranium industry looks like, and what has been very well done by the Kazakh government. The fact that they've used that resources to create links and bridges with a number of countries. And today, the uranium industry in Kazakhstan is structured around joint ventures, and there are joint ventures with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the French, with the Canadians, with the Japanese, with a number of nuclear countries, if you see what I mean. And that's a very good way to not select one side and keep that diversification. And I think that was brilliantly done. If you take another example where we are in uranium and where, for some reason today, we are the only miner, and this creates difficulties as well, is Niger, where we're the only uranium mining company at the moment, mining in Niger. But when you do that, you get all the focus on you, and it's not a very good situation to be in as well, because then you've got a lot of the fake news saying that you're taking, the local government hostage with what you're doing. So there is a Chinese project in Niger, there is a Canadian project in Niger, and we see that very positively. We don't want to be the exclusive miner there. And that would be an opportunity as well for the Niger government to create bridges with other countries. Now, there is one geopolitical element that is, you've not mentioned it, and that we see is tricky in a number of countries at the moment, is what I would call resources nationalism. And for a number of critical minerals, resources nationalism tends to not always respecting the foreign investors, or not always respecting some of the foreign investors. Now, when you do that, you've got the short-term political and gains, of course, and populist gains. But the long term of that is that a number of players at the end may find it difficult to operate in those countries and withdraw. And when you do that, then you leave the floor open to some other countries that would probably be less respectful for the local standard, local environment, local people, and invest less. And in my view, it's a role for government as well to be very careful with resources nationalism. In fact, resources nationalism inevitably, I think, will lead to moving from some partnership, probably balanced, to much less balanced partnership after that. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Nicholas. Interesting point there about resources nationalism. So, anyone ready to ask a question from the audience? Yes, we do have a question in the second row. A microphone. Do we have a microphone? Yes, there's one on its way. Here we are. Right the way to...
Thank you very much.
Cannot see. I can't hear the question.
Nicolas Maes, did I pronounce it correct? Terrific presentation of all. My question is, can you elaborate a little bit about the differences between the processing of regular rare earth? Не работает. Работает. The difference between regular processing of rare earth and the processing and refining in the radioactive mining. In other words, are you using the tails of uranium processing And is a process different than mining from the earth? Thank you.
Tricky and technical questions. I'm not a technical expert, but if I make it fairly simple to identify the challenges. When you do uranium extraction, you get uranium either from ore from your underground mine or open pit mine, or directly in solution like we do in Kazakhstan with in situ recovery. And then you have to process in situ recovery. In situ recovery is what is being done for uranium extraction in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, what we will do in Mongolia as well. That was done in the US, in some of the mines in the US. So you get your uranium in solution, and or you get your uranium from your ore, you put it in solution, and then the process steps are fairly simple. Either you go on ion exchange resins, and then you purify it, simple process, or you get it through solvent extraction. And through solvent extraction, liquid solvent extraction, and there your cascade for solvent extraction will be 4 or 5 units of solvent extraction. And that's pretty easy. Pretty easy. You need to master it. You need to master radioactive aspect. It's easy. When you go to the rare earths, and especially the heavy rare earth element, then the separation of them, they are very close one to the other, and the separation of them requires a much more complex steps. I was referring to, say, a 4-step solvent extraction, for example, for uranium extraction. When you go to heavy rare earths, it's tens of solvent extraction units, one after the other. And each of them has got to be properly configured and mastered. So the process part is much more sensitive, first thing. And the second thing is that with uranium extraction from the ore, each mine deserves its unit. It's a big unit, big factories, and big quantities. For rare earths, we're speaking about very small quantities. So you've got the capex for the quantity you want to extract is very significant, and you have a huge interest in getting only a limited number of factories that would process rare earth extraction for everybody. And today, this is the case with China, and only China doing it for heavy rare earths. There are projects in the US, there are projects in Europe to offer alternatives to that. But basically, it's related to the chemical aspect and the fact that, especially for the heavy rare earths, they are very close one to the other, so difficult to isolate and separate the one from the other.
But what you're saying is there's no difference if it's the tails of the uranium or simultaneous mining of uranium and other rare earths versus all of
For most of the time, let me put it that way. Most of the time, when you've got a uranium mine, there will be some critical raw materials coming with it, but in too small quantities to make it valuable to extract it. There are a few exceptions. For example, here in Kazakhstan, coming with uranium, sometimes you have rhenium, and Kazatomprom, I think, is producing rhenium out of their uranium mines in small quantities. Same in Uzbekistan. But usually the quantities are too small. On the other side, people that have rare earth mines often have radioactivity issues coming with it, because there is a bit of uranium or thorium or other radioactive element with it. And one of the steps they have to do is to separate those radioactive elements from the rare earth part, and then manage those radioactive tailings. This is sometimes what is creating tensions. For the one that follows this industry, you've seen that, I think it was called Greenland Minerals, a very significant rare earth project in Greenland that was initially stopped because they didn't manage initially to convince that they would manage the radioactive tailings properly. But there is a trick there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Nicholas. So, anyone like to ask a question? Why don't, yes, let's go to the lady in the middle row there.
Yes, I wanted to ask you a question to the representatives of your company. 80% of rare earth materials and metals are explored and mined by China. But how come? Why is it the case? Because, many parts of the world have these materials and rare earth materials and minerals in soil and subsoil. Why is it the case? Is it because the Chinese companies are faring faster when they start really mining, when they start really producing? Is this the reason? Or is it because in other parts of the world the share of these rare earth materials is too thin? Or is it just doesn't it just pay off? Or is it the case that most rare earth materials are concentrated in China? The question is, our experts say in Kazakhstan has a large share of rare earth materials. Why is that commercial mining in Kazakhstan doing so poorly?
Would you like to start, Nicholas?
I think what happened is mainly related to the next steps of the process. The people that will be using rare earths, the industries that will be using rare earths were mainly located in the US and EU market and Japan and so on, which were operating on a free market basis. And so the downstream part of the supply chain would look at cost only initially. And then nobody could beat the Chinese on costs, either because they were effective from an industrial perspective or because they were subsidized. Doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that at the end, they were capable of producing and processing and putting on the market rare earths at discounted price. And that basically killed the rare earth industry everywhere on this planet. And then when they were the only one having the next processing step, it was quite easy for them to be the only one having access to the resources and developing those deposits. Now, what is happening at the moment and what we hope will happen is that there will be other options than China, not to get China out of this industry. They will remain and they have to play a key role in that industry. But this is not good for the world to get only one option. That will generate tension, and every time there is only one option, tension increase and become a matter of division, not of efficiency. So there is a need for development of alternatives. This is going to happen with Europe, with the US in that industry that will offer alternative. For a country like Kazakhstan, again, there are two types of rare earths, the light rare earths and the heavy rare earths. For Kazakhstan, developing light rare earth separation units is probably a wise choice, and that could be feasible, and there are the deposits here. For heavy rare earths, I don't know if there are deposits in Kazakhstan, but if there were, probably the quantity of heavy rare earths coming out of Kazakhstan wouldn't justify having a processing unit in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan would be left at the moment with only one choice, sending it to China, or Kazakhstan could be left with creating synergies and agreements with other countries and get those heavy rare earths processed somewhere else than China. And probably the wise choice would be to do the two. Get an agreement with China and get an agreement with someone else to get option like was done for uranium industry.
Yes, that would certainly fit in with the multi-vectorism of Kazakhstan, wouldn't it? Geir, did you want to come in with something there?
Microphone.
I think the second part of the question was about what Kazakhstan's productive capacity is and whether it's worthwhile developing the processing industries, particularly for...
The question was, is it worthwhile for Kazakhstan to develop the rare earths industry? I would say so, especially as everyone is looking for alternative sources other than China, that Europe, Japan, South Korea, as well as the United States are looking for alternative sources. I should say, I don't know why the world allowed China to develop the monopoly that it has. It's had this monopoly for quite a while, and probably the United States should have acted sooner in terms of diversifying its sources of rare earth. I know Japan did, including investing in Central Asia. I definitely think it's worthwhile for Kazakhstan to develop its rare earth industries.
All right. Yes.
Yes, good morning. Roman Vasilenko, Kazakhstan Deputy Foreign Minister. I guess the question would be to the panelists and a little bit going back to the title of the panel, which is the Geopolitics of Critical Raw Materials. We heard from Mr. Myers that sort of the mining of rare earth metals outside of China is almost dead, or was killed. You just basically said that. Now we see, of course, the revived interest on behalf of the EU, on behalf of the United States and other key markets for these products, such as Japan or South Korea. How do you think the EU will respond? Whether it will walk the talk or run the run, as they now say, whether it will put their money where mouth is in terms of these political commitments that we hear. And do you expect the EU to be more supportive of private companies' interests in this area, or it will be private companies basically left to their own devices? How much of a support from the EU do you expect?
The EU is preparing at the moment a Critical Raw Material Act. You remember in my speech I said there are various levers: domestic mining, recycling, blah, 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 and policy and financing. In the policy part, the EU is developing the Critical Raw Material Act. And that Critical Raw Material Act first lists the critical raw materials, but as well defines and mandates the various governments to build plans to get some level of sufficiency. And so the governments, say France, Germany, blah, 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 will have to demonstrate that they have walked away from the monopolistic situation that exists today on some of those materials and demonstrate that they have secured such percentage of their supply. That will then, in turn, mandate the various states to develop partnership, mining investments, strategic investments with a number of countries. That will also create a market and create an opportunity for industrial players to invest in the next processing steps. As we said, let's imagine you secure your offtake from a rare earth mine or from whatever, a nickel mine or cobalt mine, and then you've got to get it processed in China. You've done nothing in terms of autonomy. So to create that market, force the governments to have autonomy, create the market for processing steps, and the financing part will be that the EU has now defined financial instruments that would authorize state subsidies for an industrial investment in case there is a significant and demonstrated market bias. And I think today it's fair to say that on the rare earth element, there is a market bias because there is a monopolistic situation of a country that can kill any industry by just decreasing price thanks to their monopolistic situation. So that's what is happening at the moment. And you probably see, and here in Kazakhstan you've seen that, you can probably see delegations from various European countries saying, okay, we want to establish a diplomacy for critical raw materials, what can we do? What I'm observing as an industrial player is that at the moment it's mainly at policy level, it doesn't convert into tangible industrial projects, but I think it's a matter of months or years before that translates into tangible industrial markets. We know there are feasibility studies at the moment for a number of processing steps in rare earths, but also other materials in Europe. It's happening. So it's a slow start, but you know, it's exponential. It starts slow, but then it increases fast. And that's what's happening at the moment.
Since we have the Deputy Foreign Minister of Kazakhstan here, I think I might, and we were disappointed not to have the representative of ERG. I wonder if I might take the liberty of asking a short question to yourself. I mean, to give us the position of Kazakhstan. And does Kazakhstan feel is it concerned by the tensions over competition for critical raw materials?
I should have said quietly. But no, we are not concerned about the greater competition. We want this greater competition because it would mean that the outside players, such as the EU, will work with Kazakhstan to develop the potential that we certainly have in our soil. And from what I recall, we have like 16 critical raw materials out of the list of 31 or something. that are available for mining and for processing. We are encouraged by the fact that the EU has now signed with Kazakhstan a MOU at the level of our Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen, an MOU focusing on the rare earth metals, green hydrogen, and battery supply chains. We have now signed a specific roadmap to implement this document, and our Prime Minister and Valdis Dombrovskis exchanged this document in Almaty at the end of May. And we're now planning very specific steps with the EU to develop this, the cooperation, not just at the political level, and I understand what Mr. Mais is saying, that there is such a intense contacts. There are intense contacts at the political level, but also moving down to the company-to-company level. And in fact, in the fall in Brussels, we will have, well, the EU will have a conference on this issue, and there will be a specific day devoted to just Kazakhstan. So we expect that this cooperation with the EU will have a trickle-down effect. That's why I was asking whether the EU will put its money where its mouth is in terms of supporting for this cooperation. It looks like with this critical Raw Materials Act, there will be indeed an increased focus from the EU political leadership, which will, I understand, eventually translate into the more support in terms of subsidies and in terms of financing from the international financial institutions which the EU manages, controls, such as the EIB and EBRD. So we welcome competition, we have resources, we open for business, basically. That's the message.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can regard ourselves as being treated to the unexpected bonus of a perspective from a representative of the government of Kazakhstan. Much appreciated. Unless there's anyone with a compelling need to put a final question, I think we've actually reached the end of our session. It's been quite fascinating, and I'd like you, the audience, to join me in thanking the three panelists.